So I've had the C70 for a few months now, and as requested by a couple different people in the wedding videographers group that I'm in, I'm going to give some thoughts and give a little bit of a review on it. Pre-disclaimer, I'm in no way an expert. I've had a couple different cameras and I'm an enthusiast. I really enjoy cameras and obviously I use them for my job, so I'm just going to give my thoughts on that and really give my thoughts on the C70 as a run and gun style filmmaker. So let's do that. So essentially the way I'm going to work this is whenever I've been shooting with the C70, of which I've had a couple different paid shoots and some just to get used to the camera, I've been noting down different points things that I think are good, bad, and just points to consider. And what I'm going to do is just run through each of these. There's about 10 and hopefully it'll not be too long to run through them all. And it'll just give you hopefully some clarity on different things that you have been worried about. I know for me personally, I had pre-ordered an R5 and was about to get it whenever all the overheating issues came out and came to surface, so I actually cancelled it, and whenever this camera came out I had to go for it, and it pretty much filled everything that I'm looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'll compare it a little bit to the R5, and I haven't used it by any means, neither the R5 nor the new Sony cameras, but I'm going to just take from different videos that I've watched and the specs that I'm aware of for those, and just try and compare it to those a little bit, and then also just giving you those points that I've thought through. So I know one of the biggest things with this camera, and the reasons that most of you are going to be looking at it, is 4K 120 FPS. So for me personally, I'm coming from a 5D Mark IV, so the highest that I've been shooting throughout all my weddings and every other projects that I've been working on is 4K 25 or 30 or 1080, 50 or 60. Moving up to 4K 120, there's some things that I want to jump onto, and essentially it's amazing. 4K 120 looks so good. For someone that's never even used 1080 120, just getting that extra bit of slow-mo is really great. And whenever it's in 4K, it looks even better. One of the other things is on the C70, there's so many buttons that you can customize to make whatever you want. So on the front of the camera, there's a button that I have set to change between slow and fast mode, which means that whenever I'm shooting all my regular stuff, I can set it to 25 FPS, shoot interview style stuff, anything that I'm planning on using the audio for really, I can shoot that. And then with just the click of a button, if something looks like it's going to be good, I can very easily jump straight to 120 FPS, and it slows down in the camera. So whenever you drag those files into Premiere Pro, you have a slowed down file. I know there's probably a lot of that, which most people are used to, but for me, this was a big thing, and being able to switch between those modes quickly is super handy and something which I really love about the camera. Those buttons are throughout the camera, so there's loads of different things that you're able to do. Pretty much any function in the camera that you want to customize and set to a button, you can very easily do. So like changing your white balance, setting that to different buttons. There's so many different options that you can choose from, which makes this camera really good for shooting run and gun. So you can change settings on the fly very quickly without having to worry about jumping into the menus and that taking a while and then missing a shot as a result. So a definite plus for the camera. On the camera, I currently have and have had throughout all the shots that I've taken on the camera, the Canon focal reducer. So without jumping into it in too much detail, the focal reducer is a speed booster, which means it serves a couple different functions. So it takes that Super 35 sensor that you have on the C70 and allows you to put full frame lenses on it. So essentially, if I was to put a regular lens on it, it would be more cropped in, but whenever I put on my lenses, which I've had from my 5D, so my EF lenses, I can use any regular lens and get the same coverage as what I would if I had it on my 5D. So there's no cropping in essentially whatsoever, which is a massive bonus. The second thing is, because it's a speed booster, whenever I'm shooting on this lens, so this is an f2.8 lens, but I'm shooting at f2. So what that means is like an extra stop of light, which is obviously amazing whenever you're shooting in different things like the first dance or any other low light situations. You've got an extra stop of light, but although it's an f2, you're actually still shooting at the depth of field of an f2.8 lens. So what that means is you don't have a real tiny field of focus, and you know, especially whenever you're shooting on a lens like a 1.4 or a 1.8 where you're obviously stopping down to 1 and below, that would be tiny for trying to get focus. So by using the speed booster, you're therefore getting the extra light in without having to deal with that. So it's a real bonus. For me, I had so many EF lenses before, so to start replacing all my lenses with RF lenses just to use on this camera would have been a nightmare. So the focal reducer also acts as a conversion from the RF mount that's native on the camera to an EF mount. That allows me to use all my lenses that I have currently, and to be honest, any lens that I've put onto it, I haven't had any massive issues in terms of the focus has been working perfectly on autofocus, and I've had no issues with the IS that's built into some of Canon's lenses as well. So really, it's been a real bonus so far. The one thing that I do want to note about the 120 FPS shooting in 4K is as soon as you jump into that high frame rate mode, it jumps from tracking autofocus to just regular autofocus. So it does still have autofocus, but it just won't track through doing so. And just a quick note on autofocus in general, I've found that it's been really very good. Even when you are shooting on just regular autofocus and not tracking, it's still absolutely awesome and does a very good job. I certainly couldn't fault it to any massive degree. I know there has been some people talking about it being faster than some of the old cinema cameras that Canon have had. So essentially it jumps to focus a bit quicker, which seems a little less natural than if it was like a proper focus pull. But for me personally, that's not too bad, not too big a deal, and it's very possible that Canon can change those things with firmware updates in the future. One thing that's really basic but I absolutely love is the record light on the front of the camera. It's green whenever it's just regular and then changes to red for any kind of shooting. So the way that's super useful is I was shooting a funeral and was at the top of the church with my 5D, and I was very easily able to look to the back and check and see that the C70 was still recording, because you can see that record light from ages away. So it was really useful and just something I wanted to note. I know a big thing that most people have been looking at with the C70 as a negative is there's no kind of IBIS, so the sensor isn't stabilized whatsoever. But what it does have is EBIS, so it's electronic stabilization, which means that it crops in very slightly on your footage and electronically stabilizes that footage. I have found it to be mostly pretty good, but it's just not on the same level as what you would expect from IBIS. So from what I've read on the R5, the IBIS on it is absolutely incredible, really good at taking any kind of handheld footage and allowing it to be used. So for the Sony, I know it's not supposed to be as good as the R5, but it's still very good. And from some of the other videographers that I've been chatting to who've been shooting on the camera, they've said that essentially you can shoot anything that you want in handheld. So you could shoot a full wedding handheld if you wanted to, apart from, you know, obviously really long drawn out shots like speeches. But any kind of B-roll shots is all very possible to shoot handheld. And what I would say is for the C70, from my personal experience, you can shoot handheld, and especially if you're doing basic shots where you're stood still and you're just panning up and down or panning left or right, anything along those lines, it'll do that handheld with EBIS absolutely no problem at all. The only place that I ran into issues is whenever I wanted to start moving in 3D space, essentially, so trying to do a tracking shot or anything like that. It's just not good enough. You will still see your footsteps through the movements. So certainly if you were in a pinch and you had to do that, I would say that it's probably good enough to do. However, if you're planning on doing lots of movements, you know, tracking different subjects, moving around the place, I think you're better to stick to a gimbal. And the good news is, from my experience, balancing the C70 on a gimbal has been really good. So personally, I used to shoot my 5D pretty much all day of the wedding on the gimbal. So I use a Ronin S and I love it. It's really good. The only thing that I note is whenever I'm shooting a wedding, I find it's really useful to just jump into a quick release plate, so I have a quick release on all my cameras and all my tripods, and essentially that means that anything can switch across. So whenever you're using a gimbal, it means that if I'm jumping onto a vise or anything that I want perfectly stabilized shot and just shoot on a monopod or a tripod, it was very easy to jump off the gimbal and do that. With the C70, I was not able to get it to balance with the quick release plate on the Ronin, so it's something to consider that, if you do that, or if you were planning on doing that, you're going to need to look into a new quick release system that you can use with the Ronin S, or if your gimbal has a higher payload, I would say it's possible that it could balance with it. But with just the regular setup that you get with the Ronin S and the quick release plate that comes with that, you will be able to balance on it, no problem at all, and it feels very comfortable on the gimbal. So one other quick thing to note with the EBIS as well is if you use a stabilized lens, so for example the 16 to 35mm lens that I have for Canon is a stabilized lens. So I've played about with it and shooting some shots with it. The focal reducer does also allow me to have that stabilization. So that means I've got 2-level stabilization. I have the stabilization from the lens along with the EBIS in the camera, and I found that is really a very good setup. And if you're shooting on that, you can move in 3D space a little bit more and not really have too many issues. It works very well. But obviously not all the lenses are going to be IS lenses, and therefore it's not perfect to rely on that all the time. So really, I suppose the big takeaway is if you want perfectly stabilized handheld footage, no matter what you're doing, you're going to be looking at the R5 or I suppose the new Sony cameras. But if you're happy that the only real shots you might want handheld is if you're in a pinch and want something quick handheld, you can do that and it will be okay, especially when you're shooting in 120 FPS and you've got that 4x slow-mo. Obviously any shake that you have is slowed down 4 times, so much less noticeable, and I've found that it's really very good. So one of the things that I've loved the most about the camera is the variable NDs. I'm sure there's been that situation for all of us where you've just came outside from the church where you've been shooting for a while and you go outside to get those shots and suddenly it's a nice sunny day, and even when you drop right down to your ISOs at the bottom, you just can't shoot in f2.8 or lower because there's too much light. So with the C70, all you have to do is press a button on the side and it drops an ND filter right in front of the sensor, and that's all built into the side of the camera. So it's super handy and means in those situations you're not having to faff about with a variable ND on the front of different lenses and then having 10 different variable NDs for all your different lenses, which I know can be a nightmare. So it's super handy that no matter what lens you're using, it's all built into the camera. I've absolutely loved that. And built in you have 2, 4 and 6 stop NDs, but then you can also use an extended mode up to 10 stops ND filters. So it's absolutely amazing. The tripod mounts on the bottom of the camera are a little bit strange. So in the center you have a 3/8 inch screw, so essentially the same sort of one that you would use for attaching a ball head to a tripod or anything along those lines, which isn't what I expected because on most cameras you have the 1/4 inch in the center. On the side of that you do have 2 1/4 inches, which means if you were planning on using just your regular quick release plate or anything that's just a single screw, you would have to mount to the sides unless you're willing to adapt that. However, if you have a sort of quick release plate which you can mount sideways, I know like Peak Design have one that works like that, it means that you can use 2 screws, which I suppose is better. But for me personally, I normally just mount one in the center, and even with an adapter to change from that 3/8 inch to the 1/4 inch, it's just not as strong as what I would like it to be. So I'm personally going to have to look into a new quick release system just to allow the camera to mount better to my different tripods. So just a quick mention about battery life. I have found that the battery life is absolutely amazing on the camera. So with it you get a BPA 30 battery, which I found to get about an hour 40 battery life out of the camera, pretty much shooting the entire time. It lasts much better than what I would have expected from lots of other ones. You can also jump up to BPA 60, which is essentially double the size, so you get 3 hours plus of shooting out of it. So it's really good, and means that essentially if you wanted to use a BPA 60 you could probably shoot a full day on the camera, with just one battery. The only thing to note with the BPA 60s is they stick out the back of the camera a fair bit. So if you're using it on a gimbal or, you know, handheld and you want a lighter setup, a couple BPA 30s is definitely the way to go. One of the biggest nightmares that I had whenever I first got the camera is I'd ordered the camera and waited a couple months to get it. So I'd already bought the SD cards, which the camera takes, which are V90 SD cards. So there's not that many brands out there making the V90 SD cards, and you know they're a bit more rare than what you would have some other SD cards or CFast cards or Safe Express cards. So I had ordered Lexar cards months before the camera had arrived, and whenever the camera did arrive, I put in the cards and was getting a message to say that it was filling a buffer essentially every 30 seconds of shooting, so it was an absolute nightmare, and no matter what I did I couldn't get it fixed. After some reading, I found that this was an issue with the Lexar cards, where essentially the speeds that were advertised on the card weren't really what it was operating at in the camera, so they weren't working properly. So that's one thing to note, is absolutely avoid those Lexar cards. However, I have used 2 other different types of cards now, and I've settled on the Kingston V90 cards. They're the cheapest at about £90 a card and work absolutely perfectly. I've used them for over a month now on lots of different shoots, and I've shot with them on, you know, long extended shooting and, you know, full day shooting 4K 120 all day, and haven't had a single issue with buffers filling or anything like that. So would definitely recommend the Kingston cards, and I'll drop a link to those in the description below. And then one other thing which I have absolutely loved with the camera is the audio flexibility. So I know there was a lot of people complaining about the fact that there's mini XLRs instead of full scale XLRs, but for the most part I've been shooting with just a mini XLR adapter into a shotgun mic. So I'm using one of the NTG2s, and I've absolutely loved it. It has worked really, really well, and the audio sounds very good out of it. Obviously for most people, they maybe shoot on a Rode Go system, so one of the smaller mics, and they use just a regular adapter. So in the side of the camera you do have the XLRs, but then you also have a regular input into the side, the same as all the other cameras. And the good thing is you can actually record 4 different levels in the camera throughout. So, you know, currently I'm shooting at 4 different levels, which means that should you have, you know, any kind of sudden peak, you can jump to a different file and you're gonna still have that audio without peaking. So it's super, super handy and flexible, and I suppose good for those situations where you might just have some outlying situation and you can have, you know, a backup plan for where you're not going to get cut out on your audio. So just something that I really liked about it, and you can change that through the settings super easily. You can also record multiple audio sources at the same time. So say for example you were taking a Rode Wireless Go on the groom, and you had for their voice that connected into the camera, you can also still record on the shotgun mic on the camera. So that means that you've got a backup option where should, you know, the Wireless Go not work correctly or anything like that, you can still use the inbuilt audio in the camera. And then you can also monitor that audio and select which channel you want to monitor. So you could very easily be monitoring the Wireless Go still while recording to the shotgun mic on the camera as well. Then one big thing for me has been the files as well. I've personally never had a camera that records 10-bit files, so 10-bit 422 4K files, so they're absolutely massive, and that's one thing I was very worried about. So my plan for all the weddings that I'm going to be doing is to shoot to both cards. So there's 2 V90 card slots in the camera, and you can shoot to both of those. So if you want to, you can shoot the same file to both, or you could shoot proxy files to one of the SD cards, or any other combination. Essentially, it's very flexible, and you can shoot, you know, a backup file, or you can shoot a lower resolution file to your other card. So I plan on shooting just duplicate files to the other card, just so I have that as a backup. But what that means is obviously on 128 gig V90 cards, you are only getting about 60 minutes of footage out of those cards. So that's 60 minutes, you know, 128 gigabytes, and then you're having to replace those cards. So I've currently got 6 cards, and I'm hoping that will be enough to shoot a wedding. You know, obviously talking 3 hours of footage essentially. But whenever you're, you know, jumping between 120 FPS and regular, it should be okay. Quoting 60 minutes is for if you were to shoot those entire 60 minutes in 4K 120 at 10-bit C-Log files. So it's one of the biggest files that you can shoot on the camera. The only thing being it's shooting long GOP and not all intra. So all intra you can shoot on the camera, and those are massive files, but you can't shoot those in as many frame rates as what you can shoot long GOP files. So long GOP allows you to shoot 120, whereas all intra isn't. So currently I'm shooting this in 4K 25 FPS all intra. So that means that I'm getting the most out of the camera and the highest quality files that I can. And I'm also shooting C-Log. Editing these files is really quite challenging. So if you're shooting in long GOP, I found that for me personally, I have a pretty powerful PC and I'm having to create proxy files. However, when you do create proxy files, it works really well and it's super easy to edit. But I really personally couldn't edit these files straight out of the camera. However, if you're shooting in all intra, you can edit the files. For some reason they work a lot better on the computer, whatever way that compression works, so you can edit those without any need for proxies. Also, editing those 10-bit color files is absolutely class. I can show you some footage that I've shot previously and some color corrections that I've done on it. I was shooting an interview for my St. John Ambulance division, and I found that it was super good to work with in terms of selecting different colors and changing those to essentially modify the image to get what you want afterwards. I found it very flexible, and I also found that compared to what I was used to with the 5D in terms of changing the exposure slightly, you know, cutting your highlights or anything like that, it was much easier to recover footage without losing quality compared to what I was used to in other ones. So definitely something worth noting, and you know, these are really versatile files and you can pretty much make the colors whatever you want from them, so definitely something to note. I really have found exposing on the camera and using it for regular footage super easy. I know there was some people that were complaining about getting, you know, properly exposed footage whenever shooting in log. The one thing that was great for me, which I wasn't used to coming from the 5D, is you also have all of your different features on the camera, like focus peaking, zebras, false color, everything. So there's loads of different options to help you with that exposure in the camera as well. So really, there's not really any reason that you should be struggling with exposure. And if you keep an eye on that and use the functions that the camera has, it should be super easy to get your exposure right. So personally, it's something that I've loved working with, and having all those different features, even waveform, all that sort of thing on the back of the camera is super handy to make sure that you're getting the best footage possible out of the camera at all times. So especially when you're shooting weddings and jumping between lots of different light sources where you're going to be having, you know, different exposures, it's super easy to adjust on the fly and make those things change. So I've been very happy with the purchase of the camera. I think compared to what I'm seeing for the R5 still having lots of overheating issues, there has not been a single overheating that I've had with the camera. It does have open fan ports in the camera and has a fan that runs. You can hear the fan, but it's not really very loud and it can't be heard in any kind of footage. You know, if I stop completely talking for a minute, I can't personally hear it even sitting here, and I'd be surprised if you could as well. So it definitely isn't an issue. The one thing that I am a little bit worried about is shooting any kind of open conditions where it's raining or anything like that. It would be very easy for moisture to get into the camera because it's just straight open holes in the top, the bottom and the sides of the camera for that fan to exhaust and take air in. So something to note. So if you are, you know, maybe shooting a rain shot in the evening, you're probably going to want to use a different camera for that sort of thing. But otherwise, it's absolutely amazing. Hasn't had a single overheating issue. So I think, you know, overall, I'm pretty happy with that. And especially if you have, you know, if you're already in the Canon ecosystem and have all those lenses, as opposed to trying to switch to Sony, maybe using a Metabones adapter to try and use those lenses, but then it's just never going to work as fluently as if you just stick to Canon. So I think for most people, this is probably a really good option. I really can't fault very many things about the camera. Hopefully that's been useful to you. If you do have any questions or anything, drop a comment below and I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you and answer any questions that you do have, or if there's anything that I've missed, I can definitely cover that. But as I say, I hope you have enjoyed it. I'm in no way an expert. This is the first ever review that I've had to do, so definitely, you know, leave a comment below and let me know what you think, and maybe I can do a couple things in the future and review different bits if it's something that you enjoy. Cheers, guys.